Thank you everyone for coming. As far as, I asked each person, as far as we know, this is the first in-person gathering that we've had of any kind in some years, I guess a year and a half. All the Semiosalongs have been on Zoom, which is crazy. It's also the third presentation of a series of 3 presentations that I had been planning to give for some time after the completion of my dissertation. Copies of which are over here. And all of which deal with the central theme of integrating first to what I call detotalization. That is, integrating the semiotics at first to semiotics more concerned with social sciences and literary studies and the humanities generally. And the first presentation of this series of 3 was for the Semiosalong, and it dealt with integrating with structural semiology and deconstruction. And the second one was at the Biosemiotics Glade, and that dealt more specifically with literature of biosemiotics and integrating with like German idealism, mostly Kant and Hegel, and German romanticism, I should say. And this one, on the other hand, is concerned more with integrating with what we can call ideology critique. And the theme of the session is about trying to explore the relevance of findings in biosemiotics for what we can call the social sciences and humanities. And I find that of the multiple sort of coordinates of detotalization, including structural semiology, psychoanalysis, and the semiotics of Umberto Eco, of the 3 or 4 alternate coordinates, I think this ideology critique is the one that's most useful for grounding the relevance of biosemiotics for social problems, if you will, and grounding the social commitment of biosemiotics, which I believe is important today, especially if we are to persuade people from outside of biology that biosemiotics should be interesting or relevant to them. So the presentation is all about integrating biosemiotics with social science and vice versa. So there are like 2 directions of integration that I'm concerned with. And the first direction of integration, that is to answer the question, what is the relevance of biosemiotics for social science, is not simple, I guess. And it is also not the main focus of this presentation. The main focus of this presentation is about the second direction of integration. But nevertheless, I would briefly summarize what I believe to be the benefit of biosemiotics for social sciences, but only very briefly. And as I'll point out, if you're more interested in my hypothesis about the value of biosemiotics for social science and the humanities, you'll of course want to refer to my dissertation, which is over here. And there are extra copies, and you can take one if you want. But in my mind, it's all about this problem, the problem of relativism. Because I think that in humanities and social sciences today, it is indeed the problem of relativism, which is the dilemma and the reason why the humanities are on the ropes now. One of the major reasons why humanities have been marginalized, and why there can't seem to be any agreement between the various camps of the social sciences, or between the legs of the tripod of post-structuralism, if you will, that is feminism, post-colonialism, and Marxism. There doesn't seem to be any common ground between the 3. Because none of them are willing to be accountable to the vocabulary of the other camps. And the classic task of semiotics, of general semiotics, was indeed to provide a unifying vocabulary for the human sciences, if you will. Initially, the solution was posed by linguistics, and that was the semiotic approach. Semiotics proposed to bring together the social sciences and humanities by lending universal vocabulary grounded in general linguistics, I guess. Subsequently, this approach to finding an umbrella science, finding vocabulary for the umbrella science, this approach was discredited. The linguistic term was discredited, and now the opinion is that structural semiology, at least, or semiotics at large, insofar as it can be reduced to structural semiology, is logocentric. And we aren't interested in answers that only come from linguistics because somehow this answer is anthropocentric or linguistically deductive. And semiotics is seen to become irrelevant because of this disavowal of the linguistic term, et cetera, et cetera. And so the classic solution of semiotics for the problem of relativism seems to be passé, seems to be no longer a value. And this is one reason why biosemiotics is an alternative to restoring the initial ambition of semiotics to unify the social sciences. Needless to say, I believe that if this grand ambition could be fulfilled, if semiotics really can finally restore this unity and bring this unifying vocabulary, it can also address the problem of identity politics, which I think is identity politics, I say in quotation marks, which is the most divisive problem in social sciences and humanities today, which is reducible to the problem of relativism. The various camps are not willing to speak to each other. But, as I said, this solution, where do we find this unifying vocabulary, is from the biosemiotic, and it is not simple. It has something to do with the reworking of information theory, I would say. For the broadening of information theory to include theories from thermodynamics and a theory of reference, I guess, context specificity, to deformalize information theory. And we get a lot of progress in that direction from, for example, Ernst. Another thing biosemiotics bring, or a general area that biosemiotics has proposed is relevant to providing this language, is to enhance theories of self-organization and morphodynamics, and to theorize as if a second order self-organization that's relevant to culture and mind. Again, Ernst is a good example of someone who's pursued this. He calls it teleodynamics. And another way is that supposedly biosemiotic theories of this sort can provide a systematic account of sensory, motor, affect, and emotion. So this is all connected, I guess, to integrate the theory of sensory, motor, affect, and emotion into information theory to somehow develop a systematic account of all these things, a more referential or dimensionally fuller account of meaning in general. Because semiosis, or the object of interest of biosemiotics and semiotics generally, is not entirely formalizable. But this is not to say, and this is the main claim of semiotics, is that just because it's not formalizable, semiosis and meaning, does not mean we cannot approach it systematically. And somehow, then the semiotic approach is a combination of formalistic approaches and other more qualitative methodologies, I suppose. So, the fifth chapter of my dissertation is where I go into the most detail about the answers provided for these questions by biosemiotics. By focusing on two of the principal authors, or the most well-known authors from biosemiotics, they're Friedrich Sternfeld and Ernst. In the case of Sternfeld, I go into his doctrine of natural propositions That is the naturalization of propositional theory of subject-predicate relations, and the proposal that propositional structure predates language as such, that subject-predicate relations are actually common to biology, to even the simplest forms of biology, and thus the linguistic subject-predicate relation is something which comes afterwards. So I go into this. I also go into his diagram notion, where all semiosis can be understood as diagram transformations. And in diagram transformations are useful ideas because in this spatiality, there's somehow a greater degree of ambiguity, and thus this somehow captures the plurality and multidimensionality of semiosis better than would, say, a language or formal logic. And in the case of Deacon, I talk about his theory of teleodynamics and self-organization and what he calls the causal force of absence, which is about broadening the notion of cause beyond, like, Newtonian science, where all cause is a measurable material or physical cause. Whereas Deacon wants to say, based upon his theory of absence, that even meaning and purpose can exert causal force. And he explains all this in terms of constraint and absence, which has some very interesting philosophical precedents, which I may get into later. And then further here in this chapter, I go into a bit more detail about what it is in Deacon and Sternfeldt's work which needs to be changed in order that this very complex theory, may be adapted and become relevant to problems of social science and the humanities. And so they have arguments between each other, and I deal with this through exegesis of their very complicated works. I deal with this, and I develop even a biosemiotically grounded, you see in section 5.4, biosemiotically grounded theory of ideology, or ideology critique. Where, I mean, the gist of it just is like ideology proposes that there's a difference. There are good and bad ideas. Ideological ideas are bad ideas, and we can point to them and they have common features, and we can even ground our claim, a normative claim about bad ideas in science. It's a dangerous claim. It's a broad claim, but it's a claim we need in order to combat the problem of relativism, of moral and ethical relativism. Yes, that's the claim. And so part of my presentation is that how can we, what can we take from the other direction, from classic theories of ideology, critique, and social sciences, and give to biosemiotics such that this attempt at fusion between the two schools can be more deliberate. And I do believe that I'm not proposing to borrow from humanities and sciences generally here in this presentation, but rather specifically from what I call dialectics, or ideology critique. And you can see in this diagram from my dissertation, so for example, I presented about the top left topic on my first presentation, and today I'm talking about integrating this one, ideology critique, with this. Here's the biosemiotic stuff, Deacon Sternfeldt. Today the idea is to borrow specifically from here, from ideology critique and from dialectics. Because I believe it is indeed a dialectical biosemiotics, which is going to give us, which is going to show the relevance of biosemiotics for social problems, specifically for social problems. And I would call this, in my theory, in my dissertation, it's a Peircean biosemiotic ideology critique. So that all bit was what is the basis of this claim that biosemiotics is important for social sciences and humanities? And that's the first direction of integration. But we're done with that now. Now we move to the other direction. That is, what does biosemiotics, specifically Peircean cognitive and biosemiotics, still need to learn from this other tradition? My dissertation is all about explaining what it has to learn from all three, or all four of these, but today it's just this. What does biosemiotics have to learn from this? What does a dialectical biosemiotics amount to? No. This thinking is not without precedent. It's not entirely original. And when I bring it up, dialectical biosemiotics, it raises the specters of many long disputes, I guess. The first being between Ernst and Hegel. And there's a pretty long list of literature. This doesn't even begin to represent the total list of literature which compares the thinking of Ernst with Hegel, with dialectics. And the main dispute is Ernst already dialectical? I'm not sure how many of you know Ernst all that well. I'll just repeat again that, biosemiotics is not dominated by Ernst, but Ernst is a big name, and Percy, specifically Percy in biosemiotics, is the interest of my dissertation. And in the field of specifically Percy in biosemiotics, what we get mostly is a disavowal of the Hegelian aspects of Ernst. And the claim that indeed Ernst was no Hegelian, and dialectics is nothing like Ernst's. Ernst has these three categories of firstness, secondness, and thirdness. And this sort of icon index symbol maps to firstness, secondness, and thirdness. And there are many further divisions and subdivisions of this triadic approach to design typology. Anyway, so you can already see some commonalities between the triadic categoriology of Ernst and the dialectical approach, which is, in the simplest sense, is just thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But dialectics is much more complicated than that, and that's part of what I'm going to explain now. But anyway, so many of the Persians, for example, Sternfeld, who I mentioned before, want to distance Ernst from Hegel as far as possible, without really saying why, other than that Hegel was indeed an idealist, and other than that Hegel had no training in science, hard science, unlike Ernst, who did. So there are certainly real differences between Ernst and Hegel. But nevertheless, I believe the main motivation for this disavowal of Hegel is rather politically motivated, in the sense that Hegel has this indissociable link with ideology critique, yes, which has a definite social commitment. And it's rather contra Sternfeld. I want to bring that social commitment to the fore, instead of pretending like it's not important. Yes. But so, on my side, there are many Ernst and Hegel scholars who agree with me. I will point specifically to Stern, this paper in particular, which shows all the reasons in detail, the Persian reading of Hegel and vice versa, the Hegelian reading of Ernst, etc., etc. But further, on the topic of precedents for dialectical biosemiotics, indeed, not just Hegelian Ernst is there literature available, but there's also a Hegelian Persian biosemiotics, which has already been pretty well developed. The literature exists, and there are numerous scholars who pursue it at a certain length, and I would seek to pursue it a bit further, but I would point to Salte, a name which I really only recently became familiar with, because of Aaron Gar, who's an Australian philosopher, I guess, but he's also involved in the biosemiotics movement. And in Gar's, in Salte's work, in this development and evolution, complexity and change in biology, you see from the table of contents at least. Not only does he have this, very similar to Terence Deacon, a development of information theory, which attempts to ground information in reference and give it some kind of dimensionality which formal information theory lacks. But it's also got the Persian element where he explains these ideas in terms of firstness, secondness, and thirdness, but further, and most importantly, he explains this as dialectics. And in his other books. Yes. And I haven't read that much of it. Probably should. But so, on this basis, I feel that there's plenty of historical precedent and philosophical precedent to pursue this dialectic. And I would organize the remainder of the presentation in terms of what are the benefits then? So let's say that it's feasible. What then are the benefits of the dialectical biosemiotics? There are three principal benefits. Let me start with the first one. Secretly, of course, the actual reasoning for the content of this presentation is just that I've been reading Jameson a lot lately, and I love Jameson, and I'm reading it and I'm seeing all these connections with Biosemionics. I'm like, okay, I want to talk about this. I'm just coming up with excuses to talk about Jameson. So I'm going to give 3 slides of quotes. Not entirely quotes, but the next 3 slides have a bunch of quotes, and they're all from Jameson. And they're all from this book, Late Marxism, Adorno, or the Persistence of the Dialectic. There's a number of reasons why it's this book specifically, which I feel is relevant, but a major one, which will come up later, is just that late Marxism is quite a bit different than classical Marxism or your grandpa's Marxism. The notion of the dialectic, first of all, is different. The second of all, a lot of the major features of what we think of as Marxism aren't there anymore in Adorno. He relativizes all these things so far that it begins to become a relevant question whether it's Marxism at all. And I would say, actually, for our purposes, probably it's more misleading than anything to even call it that. And this is the opinion that I've kind of come around to, and which I state in my dissertation as well. Is that while I'm very interested in the idea of ideology critique and of dialectic, that doesn't make it a Marxist theory, and perhaps that's the main point of the presentation. That we can take what we need from this ideology critique without importing all of the implications. We can take what we need. But anyway, I'll get back to that later in my final slides. The main benefit of a dialectical biosemiotics is that it brings a more deliberate interface with so-called qualitative methods. And so it seems to me that in all principal biosemiotic literature already, that while the enterprise is a scientific one, and the interest is indeed in discourse independent reality outside the text, nevertheless, these qualitative methods are everywhere in biosemiotics. We have eco-poetics, we have eco-criticism, we have all manner and stripes of eclecticism and poetic license happening in biosemiotics. Sometimes perhaps even out of necessity, because many of us working there don't perform experiments, and thus we don't actually have a lot of material to fill up the space of the text with. And what we're really doing is rather dealing with texts that have already been written and representing them, acting almost as like journalists of science. And thus questions of rhetoric and style and aesthetics are indeed paramount. But it seems to me that in this extant literature of biosemiotics, there is no engagement of why is this necessary? Why are these textual concerns necessary? Why are the classic strategies of semiotics, not just biosemiotics, necessary to this otherwise scientific enterprise? And dialectics brings this question directly. And it's all about the alternation between natural science and history, if you will. As Jameson writes, indeed, the Adorno essay, the idea of natural history seems to me to offer a methodological proposal rather than a set of theses on the matter. We are better placed today to understand it after the extraordinary reinvigoration of evolutionary thought and the powerful rereading of Darwin himself by Stephen Jay Gould and others. So, I don't know how many of you have read Gould. Let's pass it down. Oh yeah, there are some other books. This is actually the only Gould recommend. Shamefully. But then there's some Jameson too. In the Wikipedia page on Gould, the summary of Gould's approach is something along the lines of not only is natural selection and self-preservation not the only driver of evolution, but rather it's not even the most common one. The most common driver of evolution indeed is a group of individuals within a species group making the creative choice to diverge from the species and make its own path. Here we get into epigenetics and so on and so on. Second paragraph or so in Gould's Wikipedia profile is about his social commitment. I think I don't need to say much more than that other than to indicate that he was sympathetic to the dialectical approach. What you really notice about Gould, though, especially in this book, is the style. Yes, it is not just hard science. It mixes statistics, evolutionary theory, and biology, but not in a haphazard way. Like it's an expertise. And I argue that behind this expertise of the interdisciplinary braid that is his text, and the balance, the beautiful balance, it is indeed dialectical thinking. What is involved here, so say Jameson, what is involved here is a reciprocal defamiliarization of the two incommensurable poles of the dualism of nature and history. So, it's a really interesting idea, but it's, I mean, I guess the idea is that even a hard science, theories in hard science are established through empirical study and become factual or accepted as fact, but they change over time. There are new facts, and then the theory has to change also. And how do we articulate this change, this regulation, if you will, of the established doctrine? It has to turn back on itself via a new doctrine. And this is what's meant by the reciprocal defamiliarization. You notice the vocabulary from Russian formalism, to which Jameson is quite sensitive, the Austrian the defamiliarization. And he argues that the moment that the theory turns back on itself and modifies itself, this is an eruption of history, I guess. We can simply call it an eruption of qualitative methods, non-scientific methods within the text, which go back and alter the scientific aspect of the text. And it's based on it's based on the fact that if nature is absolutized as a first or fundamental code, then it decays into ideology even more rapidly than do the more obviously produced and class-bound ideologies of history. So, I think by what he means by if nature is absolutized, it means that if our theories of nature, or what we agree to be, for example, natural selection, if natural selection in its brilliance is accepted as the doctrine, and becomes the fundamental code, it becomes the opposite of science. This is not accountable to the facts and has to be dialectically transformed, modified. Not disavowed by any means, but modified. Okay. Dialectics happens in this way, though. It can happen at the level of arguments and paragraphs and even pages, or perhaps even just chapters. So there are different frames of dialectical integration that happen, where a theory is proposed and then its antithesis. And some kind of synthesis comes later, which doesn't reverse the first one, the thesis, but integrates it. And then there is indeed what we could call an emergent function, where the synthesis is not just a combination of the two or the rejection of the first, but something irreducible to the parts which precede it. This is the real idea behind dialectics. And it can happen at the level of the chapter comparison or paragraphs. One paragraph follows the next and introduces incompatibilities between the two, producing new information. It can even happen at the level of the sentence, though. And this, again, is why Jameson's so interested in Adorno, because it's Adorno who takes the dialect to the level of the sentence. And it is indeed in this textual experimentalism where Adorno begins to look more like a post-structuralist or a deconstructionist than he does like a classical Marxist. And I do think, indeed, that this stylistics exhibited by Adorno and Jameson are part of what we need to learn, are part of what we could benefit, part of the benefit of dialectical biosemiology. But that's the second benefit, which I believe is brought by the dialectics, which he calls contextual aesthetic, which eschews the baleful properties of the proposition form. idea is that, just like in formal logic, propositions, concrete subject-predicate relations governed by a symbol or a concept, in their closure, necessarily exclude the object of our interest, which is the semiosis, which is, by definition, plural and irreducible to a single code. This is what we mean by the claim that a sign always involves the intersection of at least two codes and an incompatibility between them, and thus a normal proposition excludes this possibility. And in Jameson's sort of narrative approach to ideology critique, he pursues this idea. He pursues the ideology critique in terms of the way that language can be understood to articulate this contradiction through dialectics. But he does not talk about the biological precedent, the biological character of this irreducible information. We call it information in scare quotes because we know already that information theory itself is inadequate to the target of what we're looking for. And there's a whole elaborate theory of Marxism for philosophy of language, which is very interesting and cool. We know the names Mikhail Bakhtin, Valentin Voloshinov, even Yulia Kristeva are all about this, all about developing a critique of traditional logic by way of derivation of logical categories from commerce and from capital. On this topic, we do have plenty of precedent already from Biosemionics. When I point to the dialectical approach to this, I would not want to say that it isn't already, this approach particularly, is not already well developed by the Persian Biosemiotics, which doesn't even bother with ideology critique. That would be just point. Frederick Sternfeld in this topic, natural propositions. And this is what I meant by the biological character of this sort of informal philosophy of language. It's not informal. I mean, a philosophy of language that would pursue non-linguistic meaning by modifying the proposition form. This is Sternfeld's approach, but I'll repeat that his contention in natural propositions is just that subject-predicate relations as a structure come before language existed. And this is the naturalization of propositions, and so that what he does is he says that the subject is an index, the predicate is an icon. What joins them is a symbol, and that's thus the union of the subject and the predicate is the DC sign. The Persian DC sign, and this is a naturalized proposition. So anyway, this is the biological approach to the very information which Jameson and other Marxists such as Adorno would pursue by another route. Sternfeld does not pursue the idea that this kind of figurative propositional play can be extended to the wider frame at level of paragraph, level of chapter, and level of separate sentences. He doesn't discuss it, but he does it in a different topic. And the claim is that the very paradigm of an expressive syntax in which the actual machinery of sentence structure is itself pressed into service in all its endless variety and mobilized to convey meaning far beyond its immediate content as mere communication and annotation. And so Sternfeld's, of course, not the only one who pursues this dialectical play at the level of the sentence in Persian terms. Many others have found in Persian text similar precedents, and this is going to be a related topic to Ludmila's presentation next about logic of relatives. It's related to the logic of relatives. The third benefit, which is the next slide, brings us back to the problem of relativism. As I said before, this play makes some confuse Adorno for a post-structuralist. But the accusation against post-structuralism and deconstruction is valid. And the accusation is that it brings a relativism which has eroded the social commitment of the social sciences. Right? Because people aren't willing to make normative claims, strong normative claims we need to make today when we're faced by serious problems. Yes? And it seems that structuralism in semiology has failed us in this. And it's one of the reasons for the decline of semiotics. And we can say it's true. It is true. It's just a problem. It doesn't mean we should disavow deconstruction in structural semiology. It just means that we need to, first of all, take what we need from it, from structural semiology, and apply it to biosemiotics. This is going to be the topic of Israel's topic later, or his talk about Prieto and Biosemiotics. But not only that, but we also need to borrow from other disciplines, and this is the advantage that ideology critique has over post-structuralism in semiology. Is that it is not afraid to make these normative claims, to say ideology exists, bad ideas exist, and we can point to them, we can say which ones they are. And so, I'm close, I'm very close. But the issue is, though, that, I mean, the problems of this normativity still exist. We still need devices to regulate our claims, of course. We need to acknowledge that though we may name these bad ideas, their name yesterday is not going to necessarily be the same name tomorrow or the next day. They've taken many names. I mean, when Kant was battling it in Pure Reason, he called it empiricism, and later some will call it enlightenment and rationality. Adorno, at his time, with the Frankfurt School, they called it positivism. And later, what's common now amongst a lot of semioticians is to say it's analytic philosophy. They're the bad guys, right? And so on. You could call it capitalism, right, as many of the Marxists are wont to do, but we do understand also the productive dimensions of capital. And then, scientism. Now we're getting closer to the present day, I guess, because scientism, the idea that you can explain all problems, or that you can solve all problems with science as we know it, right, which this is closer to the problem that we're faced with today, and yet there are developments in science, such as in biosemiotics, where we are finding that science recapitulates many claims that were originally made by philosophy and semiotics. So scientism couldn't be the ultimate enemy, even, as long as we can conceive of a science in a broad sense. Maybe science can't solve all the problems. Social Darwinism is probably closer to just a really bad idea, right? The culture industry, as Adorno and Horkheimer see it, is not art or culture, but rather business as such. Here, I read this line and I thought, that's right. Isn't that the real enemy? Business. Right. Particularly when non-instrumentalizable domains such as humanities and philosophy and literary studies start to be reduced to their monetary value, and our students start to think of their philosophy degrees in terms of the money that it can make them. Business. This is the enemy, if you ask me. But we all gotta make a buck, though, right? And then self-preservation. The issue of self-preservation brings us back to the biological connection. We all have to survive, of course. But Adorno claims that the goal of his... Adorno claims, and then I guess I should say rather Jameson, who writes this sentence, claims that the goal is a utopian existence that would not be dominated by instrumental motives and would be, above all, free of the ultimate end, which is that of self-preservation. This gets us back to the critique of Darwinism and the claim that biosemiotics holds that self-preservation is not the only driver of evolutionary change. But what that claim does not bring explicitly in biosemiotics is a textual method. That is, dialectics is what transforms this claim about self-preservation into a textual method. And so, I will return to my dissertation, where I go through, before I finish, I'll just say there is another precedent here. It's Paul Cobley talks a lot about the problem of the humanities and the way in which humanities programs in academia are being squeezed out because they're all expected to fit the metrics that were formerly reserved for the hard sciences, right? And slowly we see them disappear. And you can see how uniformalizing accreditation imitation, such as they have done in Europe after the Bologna Accords, is one way where we see the logic of capital spread like a blanket. And thus, disciplines like biosemiotics, for example, are threatened by this uniformalization. Anyway, read coveted. Is it here? No, it's not here. But, so I return to my dissertation, though, because it's in chapter 2, where I go through a lot of this stuff. And the point I'm going to make here, so I talk about Zizek and I talk about Eagleton. Eagleton is really good about explaining the problem of relativism. He blames semiotics for the decline of ideology critique because semiotics brings this relativism of structural semiology. My counter to Eagleton is to say, you haven't read Biosemiotics, and you haven't read hers. So we can counter that claim. But the main claim here is to say that while I do demand that the lineage of dialectics and ideology critique be acknowledged, I want accountability to this lineage, and I don't enjoy the disavowal. Nevertheless, the modifications to this otherwise Marxist doctrine are so significant that I do believe that it is too misleading to really even call it a Marxist doctrine. It's a dialectical doctrine, and we can develop a critique of ideology that's grounded in biology. But these modifications, such as the rejection of the base superstructure dichotomy, or the relativization of base and superstructure, and the relativization of this working class bourgeoisie opposition. The problem here, the classic problem here, is simply that who gets to decide who's working class and who's bourgeoisie, right? Difficult. So it's a rather non-semiotic opposition, and unfortunately for Marx, for the other Karl, is that it's the linchpin of his doctrine. So, my conclusions. Dialectics and Peircean triadic logic can be reconciled within biosemiotics if the disavowal of this lineage is confronted. That is, the figures who refuse the commonality between Hegel and Peirce need to be challenged because this commonality is very real. One upshot of dialectics, which the Peircean approach does not bring, is a more deliberate interface between natural science and qualitative methods. I believe that this interface is really necessary in biosemiotics, some vocabulary for specifying this interface, because the mixture of qualitative methods and science is already there. We need some kind of specificity about why is it there. And this upshot entails certain dialectical, textual, and aesthetic concerns. Indeed, so it is kind of about, it's a matter of style. But just because we become concerned with style does not reduce the interest of biosemiotics to textual matters by any means. The interest of biosemiotics is going to remain physical reality. Lightning bolt. And finally, the obvious social commitment of dialectics imparts upon biosemiotics, or it may impart upon biosemiotics, greater sympathy with social science and the humanities, etc., posthumanism, etc., post-structuralism. And I think that this is key. If biosemiotics can be more straightforward about its social commitment, then it'll be clearer to them why biosemiotics is valuable to them, and why they might, if they see the social commitment of biosemiotics, then indeed they might accept our offer of a unifying vocabulary. But if they see no commitment, then they will not accept this offer. That's my view. So, I think we're going to take questions after the first session, so we'll save questions for after colleagues talk, but next is moving on.